Welcome, everyone. Thanks to Bill for being here again today, and we're looking forward to this.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you, Joe, for passing on the questions in advance. It's always great to have a heads up. And first, let me thank the Greater Minnesota Regional Parks and Trails Commission for this opportunity to share this information and recap some of the information that we've shared in the 3 quarters previous to this one. And it's been my pleasure to be a part of this opportunity and share with those of you in Minnesota that are trying to create accessible and inclusive environments so that everyone has an opportunity to come and participate. My name is Bill Botten. I'm an accessibility specialist. I worked for 22 years with the U.S. Access Board and specifically on the 2010 ADA standards and Chapter 10, the recreation facility requirements, as well as I worked specifically in the assembly seating area, arenas and stadiums. But I am a person that uses a manual wheelchair and have for over 40 years as a result of a motor vehicle accident where I was ejected from the vehicle where I wasn't wearing a safety belt. Um, it is really, to me, it's a great opportunity to also highlight that we're in the 35th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act and that ongoing commitment for organizations to promote and really think about programmatically, but also how you're designing and constructing facilities to make sure that all ages, all abilities, all the time have this great opportunity to recreate. And um, I think Chapter 10 in the Americans with Disabilities Act, Chapter 10 of the 2010 ADA standards, is really one of the most important inclusive opportunities for people with disabilities because it's the stuff we all, live for, right? We work to play, and that play is our evenings and weekends with our families and friends. And as a parent myself, that was such a great opportunity to be able to not only just sit and watch, but to be able to feel like I was engaged in the opportunities in play, or get onto a fishing pier, or walk a local trail that they were learning to ride their bikes on, or things like that. So the opportunity to recreate and play is such an important part of right who we are as Americans, and hopefully through this presentation and the other ones that we've already produced, that need has been highlighted repetitively, and you see the need for it. It's the only minority group that everybody's going to be a part of if you get the fortune to live long enough. Whether you have low vision, you're hard of hearing, you're deaf, you're blind, you're unable to walk the distances that you used to, or even ambulate at all, and you use a mobility device, maybe a walker, a wheelchair, a cane. Um, our previous forum, the first quarter, was in accessible play areas, and we're going to highlight some of the important features of that. And then our second one was on accessible picnic and camping facilities, and I believe I have that reversed. I think it was pedestrian trails and shared use path. Then we did accessible picnic and camping facilities. And as Renee said, I'm willing to take your questions anytime through the chat when we're on these subjects. And we do have quite a few that were pre-submitted that we're going to talk about as well throughout this presentation. So I'm hoping finally we leave you with some resources that you can use to further your education or your understanding of what you're creating, because it's so important, as we're going to learn today again, that once you create something, it's there for a while, and it's really hard to go back and recreate or redo to include accessibility. And if you do it from the right from the beginning, it saves everybody a lot of time, energy, and you're supporting features and facilities that are going to be there for decades, and hopefully will support again all abilities and all ages. So those minimum requirements are just that. They are minimums. We're always trying to encourage beyond that. I tell people in my trainings all the time that it's really a low C or a D. You passed, but you really did nothing special. So really getting the community buy-in, understanding who's the consumers, the participants in your programs and are using your facilities is really the way to make sure that you're exceeding those minimum requirements. The Architectural Barriers Act, that second point, and I'm showing you the cover on the left side, is the requirements for accessibility on federal land, federal facilities, oftentimes even federal funding. And if you do get federal funding, it's important to understand what that funding source is requiring you to comply with, and it may be the Architectural Barriers Act. Um, Almost 2 years now, the U.S. Access Board issued guidelines for what's called the public right-of-way, and they address both the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Architectural Barriers Act. So they're applicable once adopted by not only federal sites, but also state and local government and places of public accommodation that are required to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. The International Building Code, your model building code, has been increasingly um, extending the boundaries of what those minimum requirements are. And so it's so important to understand what your state and local codes, their specific edition for your municipality, for your county, what they're saying on certain things. They may have increased accessible parking. They may have required an increased clear floor space. Typically, not so much countywide, but more statewide do we see these increases in the levels of accessibility. And that's an important feature that state codes and municipalities codes and do not fall underneath the federal requirements. They exceed them. And so the scoping or the technical requirements will increase, could increase the clear floor space or maneuvering space, or the requirement for an automatic or power assisted door, increase the scoping for parking. So always make sure that you check your state and local codes to make sure you're in compliance with them as well. Um, I would just like to say that the process to become a standard or when it's a guideline is really important to understand, and that the 2010 ADA standards have been adopted. So it's a two-step process. The U.S. Access Board, the agency that I formerly worked for, writes minimum guidelines that then have to be adopted by a standard setting agency. And in this case, for the Department of Justice is the Americans with Disabilities Act enforcing agency. For the Architectural Barriers Act, it's the U.S. Access Board. And so if you would get a complaint, a civil rights complaint, that a person with a qualified disability is complaining that their civil rights are being violated by inaccessibility or lack of program access, those would be the agencies that would be asking the questions, if they're working, of what the issues were and how to resolve that complaint. Important to understand that guidelines are just that. They have not yet been adopted by a standard setting agency. They're not enforceable. They are a best practice. They are as what's coming. It would be like an ostrich putting their head in the sand if you didn't think that you wanted to build to that, if you were currently doing construction or constructing these unique types of facilities that are addressed in those guidelines, because that's what's going to be. And you don't want to have a barrier down the road. So you always want to be following what's coming, right? You always want to know what the clear floor space might increase to, or is things going to increase in size, that type of thing, so that you plan ahead and that your facilities are constructed correctly from the beginning. Um, I highlighted these reference standards because if you have the standard, you have the book, you have the 2010 ADA standards, you don't have the whole thing unless you have the reference standards, right? For whether you're doing a platform lift, a means of egress, you've got I don't know, an alarm system. There's reference standards for all those different features as well as play area surfacing. And so we're going to start into the requirements for play areas. And the reason I bring these up is that if you're an individual that has the opportunity to purchase playground surfacing, you need to understand that you want a certificate from who's ever supplying that surface for ASTM 1292. And that's the fall attenuation requirements to make sure that that surface passes that fall attenuation requirement even after it's installed. And for how long will it? If we're going to install a unitary rubber surface that's 1.5 inches thick over asphalt, how long is that going to stay soft enough to prevent head injuries? You want to understand that by knowing that periodically in the contract for your surfacing, you have an opportunity for somebody to come out and test that. ASTM F1951 is the other standard that is only currently a lab test, but you want to have a certificate from who's ever producing that or supplying your surface that surface has met ASTM F51. Okay, so these reference standards are very important if you're the one that's purchasing, installing, or maintaining accessibility in a play area. because those accessible routes are 60 inches wide, and that surface has those reference standards that it has to comply with. There's a running slope, a cross slope, an openings requirement, a change in level no greater than a half inch, all within that surface. Remember, the requirement is that you connect elements and spaces on the same site with at least one accessible route. So every component at ground level or elevated needs to be connected by an accessible route. When I say that, one of each type at ground level is the minimum requirement. We're hoping that you would do two. I'm circling on the right-hand side of swing bay where they put a unitary rubber mat underneath an engineered wood fiber surface to try to decrease the level of maintenance required underneath that swing where the kick out of the surface no longer provides a level surface. So the idea at ground level is one of each type. That's your scoping. At elevated, you're talking 50% of your elevated play components have to be accessible. So when you're understanding or buying playground equipment or you're evaluating existing facilities, you would have to understand, okay, I need one of each type at ground level, and I need half of those at an elevated level to be accessible. That's the minimum requirement. But that 50% of elevated play components has a threshold to determine whether ramps are required, or as I'm showing you in the left-hand picture, a transfer system. But no matter what type of elevated plate components you provide, it's either ramp or transfer system. Determining the difference on the left is ground level. You're getting off and on the ground. A lot of climbing structures are like this, right? They may have a plate component up on top, but if you can reach an elevated plate component from an elevated level, it's now an elevated plate component only. And I'm showing you just a ring climber on the right-hand side that can be accessed from an elevated platform or deck. Even though it touches the ground, it's only considered an elevated plate component. It'd be similar to a slide coming off of an elevated platform, right? That slide is considered elevated even though it touches the ground. It's not considered at ground level, it's only elevated. So the difference between ground level and elevated is really important to understand when evaluating or even looking at the plans when somebody's telling you, okay, this is what we're proposing for this play area. A lot of children are unable to leave their mobility device. A lot of children are unable to climb, right? So we need to provide as many opportunities at ground level as we possibly can. And that's the idea of the scoping chart that I'm showing you now that's in the standards. And it's based on how many elevated plate components am I providing? And then it determines, well, if you're going to do that many elevated, you have to minimally do this many ground level. And not only ground level, but you have to do this many different types. Okay. And when we talk about types, we think about climbing or sliding or swinging, just the general type of motions or activity that's being created as a type. So ramp access to 50% of the plate components means no additional ground level has to be provided. So imagine this, you have an elevated plate structure and you've ramped it, and at least half of those plate components up on that are accessed by that ramp. There's no requirement to increase the ground level because you're really providing that same level of ground level access at an elevated level for persons that are unable to maybe leave their mobility device. The threshold is 20. Less than 20 elevated plate components, you can get away with just a transfer system, which means you got to leave your mobility device, you got to crawl, scoot, or do something. If you're more than 20, 25% of the 50% required to be accessible has to be accessed by ramp. Hopefully you make that opportunity to do all 50% accessed by ramp, but at least a quarter of those required to be accessible must be by ramp. There's a lot of good information. There's a frequently asked questions that's available from the website that I'm providing you here. There's a surfacing guide that says the name of it is, well, first let me back up and say that it was put out by the U.S. Access Board funded, but it was done by the formerly National Center on Accessibility. And it's the 7 things every playground owner needs to know about their surface material. And it really looks at the characteristics of installation and maintenance and the cost of that over a period of years to try to give you more information. The guide that you see there in black and white was one that we did a long time ago, but it really brings all the technical assistance information to one space. So the scoping and technical are all there. It also gives you a little chart to run through and try to understand how to evaluate an existing play area. There's the completed research, there's these guides, and there's also webinars that are archived even with my first quarter one here that goes into greater detail about play areas. And so I wanted to address one of the pre-submitted questions that we had for play areas. And it talks about, it says, I see a lot of climbing activities that I don't know that I would consider accessible. Since we are trying to incorporate at least one of each type of play, what does a good accessible climber look like? Someone that for all abilities. That's a really challenging one, but I'll say this, that if the climbing opportunity has a wide grid, which the space is wide open, maybe 10 inches, 8 inches, 12 inches openings, that's very difficult, right? If it's more like a snow fence where it's a netting that's got a very small opening, it's easier to scoot or crawl on. The same with what we see now being used as conveyor belt material. Conveyor belt material is easier on the skin to crawl, can be hot though if it's black and put in the sun a lot. But that conveyor belt material is being used more and more now for transfer systems. Instead of the platform and stairs, they're using a platform and this conveyor belt material to make it easier to scoot or crawl instead of being on stairs. And so I think when I think about an accessible climber, I think about, okay, first, if I'm going to leave my mobility device and get onto a climber, is there a level platform for me to get over onto to leave the wheelchair and then start trying to get to an elevated position? I think it's got to be a very closed grid netting system or a conveyor belt system to really make it inclusive to get to an elevated level. Okay. If you have a climber and you add plate components at an elevated level, those become elevated plate components, and it does require a transfer system or a ramp based on how many elevated plate components are being provided. Remember that 20 elevated plate components is that threshold. And so placing elements up at an elevated level typically create elevated plate components. Elevated plate components have to be connected by a transfer system or ramp. I was wondering if we had any submitted questions in the chat now about play. No?
No, nothing yet.
Okay. Well, I'll just reiterate that there is this opportunity throughout this presentation to ask questions about the specific subject matter, and even those that may not specifically apply, we can take at the end of this. So I'm going to try to run through the next section as well. And the next session that we did was on shared use path and pedestrian trails. And those are some really unique facilities, and the requirements are very different. And understanding the population that's going to be using the type of facility and how we're designing it and for what triggers you to understanding the design requirements, the technical requirements for the facility type you're creating. So remember accessible routes, and that's the recreation facility requirements. An accessible route is minimum 36 inches wide. It has a running slope no greater than 5%, or else you got to do handrails on both sides all the way to an 8% running grade. This is typically what you find in an office building, but it could also be an exterior accessible route. We were just talking about play areas would have an exterior accessible route through that play area surface, but also from site arrival points to the facility entrances, from transportation stops to a facility entrance. And each, requirement says that for accessible routes that at least one accessible route connects all elements and spaces required to be accessible on that same site. So if you have a route going to a fishing pier that's all the way across the park, that route from site arrival is not a trail. That's an accessible route because you're required to have at least one accessible route connecting that element on the same site from site arrival points. Pedestrian access, a sidewalk, typically in an urban area along the right-of-way. Shared use paths may leave the public right-of-way. They're typically hiker, biker type issues we're going to talk about in our next slide. And then pedestrian trails are just that, pedestrian access. So look at that key design element. What type of facility are we creating? Are we allowing bicycles? Are we not allowing bicycles? Are we connecting elements on that same site? We had some questions about trails that were pre-submitted, and then I'll get to some of them, but I just want to say that the requirements for not only an accessible route, but a trail and also a shared use path require the surface material to be firm and stable. and it has a change in level requirement of no greater than a half inch. Those on a pedestrian trail, you can have up to 2 inches, but still that change in level is typically tried to be minimized, especially when we're on accessible routes of connecting elements or spaces of no greater than a half inch. And so one of the questions we got was, would a mowed surface fulfill the surface requirements to be a trail? I would have to say no. The Department of Justice in some of their issues that they've come down on in certain cases have determined that grass is not an accessible surface. And I would hold true to a trail surface probably as well. Unless you could maintain the firmness and stability, make sure that that change in level is no greater than 2 inches throughout that whole area, and that your running and cross slopes meet that requirement. I think it'd be very challenging to show that a mowed surface, unless it was some really fine grass or something, where you could have the continuity that you really need. I would stick away from grass as being the accessible surface. I would probably lean towards compacted decomposed granite or limestone, whatever you could get quarried close to you. I would build a surface instead of just mowing a surface. I just think there's too many irregularities in a mowed surface to be considered accessible. Um, you may be able to prove me wrong if you had a surface that was highly uniform, like a manicured football field or something like that, where we knew there really wasn't going to be the changes in level or that the surface characteristics were very constant. So the accessibility guidelines for the public right-of-way have not yet been adopted by either the Department of Justice or the standard setting agencies like the General Services Administration to become the standard on federal land. Okay, so they are still going through that process, and at this time, I don't see them adopting them anytime soon. It'll be well to say that new guidance for accessibility will come out, and the administration currently has a moratorium on any new standards coming out, that you would have to retract many in order to issue one. And I don't see these organizations, these standard setting agencies, having anything to retract in order to issue anything new. So they do remain as guidelines. The most important thing is that even though they apply to the Architectural Barriers Act accessibility standards, they really should be used by state and local governments, their facilities, as a best practice. It is coming. It is something that these design requirements are going to be made a requirement, not necessarily immediately, but really soon. Now, the pedestrian trail requirements, again, only applicable under the Architectural Barriers Act accessibility standards. So new construction of a trail on federal land right now does trigger the pedestrian access requirements, not the shared use path, which are still guidelines, best practice, but not a standard. So facilities, state and local governments that are trying to build pedestrian trails should use these minimum requirements to the best of their ability. The application is for new construction or altered facilities that connect to a trailhead or to another trail that substantially complies with the standard. Okay? There are a series of exceptions for both new construction and alterations. They became effective November 25th of 2013 for the Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Forest Service land, and the U.S. Department of Interiors, which is Park Service and Fish and Wildlife and Bureau of Rec and Bureau of Land Management. And I know I'm forgetting some, but there's everybody that's under the Department of Interior. Currently, in new construction after 2013, we're already looking at 12 years old. 12 years, the requirements for pedestrian trails on federal lands have been a requirement. Again, if you're receiving federal funding for the construction of a trail, I would want to make sure that that funding source is not requiring you to comply with the Architectural Barriers Act accessibility standards. If it is, you would have these as your minimum design requirement. Otherwise, it would still be considered as a best practice, right? So facilities constructed or altered with federal agencies. Now, I've put under here on the right-hand side, facilities subject to the ADA, and also ADA facilities built or altered with federal grants and loans. When this rulemaking came out, it originally stated that you wouldn't have to do that. But since then, I've seen grant applications that stated that if you receive that money, you would have to comply with the Architectural Barriers Act. So all I'm saying is if you receive federal funding, make sure that you understand what the federal funding source requirements are, what application applies before you move forward. So it could be a requirement. It should be what you're doing. It is a best practice, and I'll briefly tell you some about it. It discusses trailheads. It discusses the signs that you decide to put in a trailhead. It discusses the technical requirements for that trail itself, running and cross slope. The tread obstacle can be up to 2 inches. Firmness and stability is the minimum requirement, and a 36-inch minimum width, similar to an accessible route, is always required. It does require a minimum of 36 inches through trail gates and barriers, always a minimum of 36. And it does address facilities that are constructed along trails, picnic or camping facilities along a trail. I've highlighted here a website where you can get the requirements for picnic camping, pedestrian trails, viewing areas, and beach access in a technical assistance guide from that website for free. Okay, so very important to understand what scoping and technical requirements apply to a pedestrian trail or facilities created along pedestrian trails to make sure that you're at least meeting these minimum standards for federal facilities, best practice for Title II. I briefly wanted to tell you about the shared use path requirements. Again, they came out just over a year ago from the U.S. Access Board. They're still guidelines, they're a best practice, but they're very different. Understanding what you're creating again is huge. And those design requirements that are attached with that construction. So it's a multi-use path, primarily for use by bicyclists, pedestrians, or other unauthorized motorized or non-motorized users. Anymore, we see a lot of e-bikes, right? We see a lot of E-type vehicles being used on shared use path. They're for transportation purposes, but they also may just be for recreation. Oftentimes in housing developments, we see shared use path, right? People want the ability to take off from their house and just go on a walk. But they could be used as a transportation opportunity to and from work, to and from along a river or wherever you're trying to go. So shared use paths are physically separated from motor vehicle traffic by either open space or a barrier and are either within a highway or public right of way. That's an important feature. Okay, so the requirements are different if you're in that right of way or if you're separated away from and have an open space between you. The width is determined by the jurisdiction. We see them anywhere from 8 to 12 feet, typically with a border on each side that's grass. There's requirements for when you have a bollard. Typically, you never want a bollard. If people are riding bikes at a high rate of speed, you don't want them to be facing any quick turns. The surface is firm, stable, and still does require slip resistance. There's a very long one here outside of where I live in Washington, D.C. called the C&O Canal, and it runs all along the Potomac River for almost 180 miles. And very little of it is asphalt concrete or even boards. Almost all of it is crushed aggregate. And it's in a floodplain, and they're able to maintain it. And it's a 10-foot wide path with a 3-foot border on each side. The running grade cannot exceed what the grade is established to adjacent street. Now, this is one that's located in a public highway right-of-way. You're looking at a cross slope of up to 2%. When you're thinking about located outside the public right-of-way, maybe it's going through the woods, it's away, the maximum running grade is 5%. Now, that's a real challenge in a lot of topography. Hopefully in Minnesota, you won't be facing much of that, but around the country, that 5% running grade requirement for a shared use path is huge. It does require handrails on both sides, which you never want on a bicycle path if you can always avoid it. So minimizing that running grade to under 5% is huge when you're outside that public right of way. Curb ramps and shared use paths. Remember, your curb ramp is going to be as wide as your shared use path. You never want to narrow down. It does talk about flangeway gaps if you're crossing railroad based on if it's a light rail or a freight. You've got an opening minimum or maximum requirement. It does talk about detectable warnings. Again, the full width of the curb ramp at a shared use path if you're going across the street or a hazardous vehicular area. It addresses site furniture like benches. It requires 50% of the benches to have a clear space adjacent to it. in the same grouping. There are exceptions for the surface characteristics based on physical constraints or regulatory constraints. So physical constraints could be the amount of right-of-way that you have. A regulatory constraint could be maybe it's an Endangered Species Act or something like that. So there are exceptions from certain conditions or technical requirements based on what type of constraints there are. I've provided a QR code here, and I don't do a lot of those, but this one here will get you to a playlist that the U.S. Access Board created that describes more about the public right-of-way minimum requirements. And if you're designing or constructing that type of facility, it would be important for you to watch some of those playlists and learn more than I've been able to teach you real quickly. So this ends the section on trails and shared use paths. And I have another one that came in earlier that, why don't I address that while you're getting ready to see if there was any that came in. And the idea is the outdoor developed areas, which is the rulemaking that I talked to you about that currently applies under the Architectural Barriers Act for federal facilities that addresses pedestrian trails. They're asking if if an organization or a county or city government has not adopted them as directive or as their minimum requirements when constructing these types of facilities, um, do you think that by meeting that best practice, as I was telling you, the best practice of even though they're not a standard for the type of facility because you're a state or local government, um, is not required as a standard for you and your county or your funding source hasn't required it, would it be best practice or could you meet what to call program access? Now, I've not really talked to you about program access yet, but remember that the Americans with Disabilities says that your programs, your services, and your facilities have to be accessible to, and the real kicker here is usable by people with disabilities. And so how do we ensure that of happening? So usable by people with disabilities. So if that's the overriding obligation for the Americans with Disabilities Act, whatever you create, that's saying that in your existing facilities, maybe not every single one of your trails has to be accessible, constructed a long time ago, but that over time it's a barrier and you want to evaluate where those barriers are. But that if you're doing an alteration at that site, that it would require you to come back and make that alteration accessible if connected to a trailhead or already an accessible trail when we're talking about trail requirements. So would you meet the program access requirements if you met these minimum guidelines for you or best practice as a state and local government? I think you need to. I honestly think that I would be looking to at least meet those minimum requirements to show, again, that you're in good faith, that you understand that you have to do something to make your facility usable by people with disability, and that that program of pedestrian hiking trails is accessible. And so I would identify the easiest one to make accessible now if all you have is non-accessible trails. I would identify the easiest one within your system that you can advertise and support and create a surface that's accessible for the distance that you can, and then start adding to that distance over time to ensure that you at least have one opportunity to hike as a pedestrian on a surface that meets some of these minimum requirements. Otherwise, what are you going to use as your standard to show that you had good faith that somebody could use it? So I do believe that programmatically, it would be a huge step to be able to show that you tried your best to meet those minimum requirements that are found in the Outdoor Developed Area Final Rule. You want to ask one? Do you have one now?
Yes, we do have one, Bill. It actually goes back to playgrounds. Question from Jennifer. If you have two separate playgrounds, a 2 to 5 year and a 5 to 12 year playground in the same surfaced space, and the swing setup or zip line is a separate freestanding unit, but also in the same surface space, would the accessible seat on a swing set or zip line count towards both playgrounds? Or would you need two accessible units, one for each playground? I think she's going back to the chart you showed earlier about number of accessible facilities.
First, let me say that it's a very good question, and that if you're designing for two different age groups, each one of those age group play structures and areas needs to be evaluated separately as independent play areas. Okay, the standard says that whether they're separated geographically or by age, they're treated as two separate areas and two different play areas per this requirement. So now you're asking that, okay, so you've evaluated the 3 to 5. Now you're looking at the 5 to 12 or 6 to 12. And we have this element that's between those two that's really probably for the older age group and at ground level for the older age group, unless you're getting onto it from an elevated structure, right? If it's coming off of an elevated structure, it sounded like it stood alone. But if it's a standalone zip slide, it's probably for that older age group, my guess. Now, the standard doesn't say that each play area has to have the exact same type of ground level play components. You just need to make sure that the 3 to 5-year-olds have their minimum requirement of ground level play components, and the other play area does as well for the older kids. So I would say it really depends on what it's designed for. Okay, what age group is that designed for? And then treat to make sure that each area has their minimum number of one of each type of ground level, and understanding that each play area doesn't have to have the same type of play experience or type in each play area. Okay. Okay, so we had another one here on trails that I think said, oh, I'm wrong. Well, I think I can address it though. It was about primitive parking. So imagine you had a trailhead with a gravel parking lot, and you had primitive parking. And this could be at any type of facility, right? It could be at a picnic or camping facility. It could be at a boat dock. It could be at a fishing pier platform. But you have this gravel parking lot, and that's your site arrival point. Okay. And from that site arrival point, you have this facility that you've created, you built. So if it was built before, well, I got to say honestly, you probably should have been watching in 2004 what the standard was going to, the guidelines said, but what the standard's going to come out with, even though DOJ hadn't adopted yet. But in 2010, the application was for March 15th, 2012. Anything built after March 15th of 2012 should be compliant with the 2010 ADA standards. So we're talking quite a while ago. So anything designed or constructed after March 15th, 2012, should be compliant, which means that your site arrival point needs to be compliant as well. And that route from site arrival to that required accessible feature be a compliant accessible route. You could do the gangway if it's a floating structure. If it's a fixed structure, it would be the ramp requirements onto or off of it. But it would be a requirement for that parking lot, or at least the accessible parking space, access aisle, and space be compliant. When I say an accessible parking space, I'm talking about a firm and stable surface that has a sign marking it. If there's only one accessible space, you'd have to determine in this primitive lot how many cars can park here. Then you'd go to the table in section 208, the scoping, to determine how many spaces do I need. If it's only one, it's a van space. It's 16 feet. The standard does require a sign. So even though it's primitive, you're going to have an accessible sign that even says van accessible. And I would really strongly urge that it just say accessible parking, not handicap parking. It could just have the international symbol of accessibility, but it should say accessible parking. I want you to think about that you have an accessible bathroom, you have accessible parking, you have an accessible facility, an accessible dock, whatever it might be, that we're using the word accessible. And so this accessible parking space would require 16 feet wide, and the standard says a sign and a marked access aisle. It doesn't say how you have to mark it. Okay. I've seen with blue wheel stops. I've seen with signs pointing in. I've seen where there's been multiple signs where they identify the space and then they identify the access aisle and say no parking in this area. It's challenging to enforce. It's hard to use, but I would say that if you're using stone, a gravel lot, I would want to mix up the stone composition to be something like a 3/4 inch, 3/8 inch minus, and then you wet it and compact it with stone dust over that accessible parking space, still using the same type of stone, just don't make it all one size, and then create that route, however it's going to be, to that accessible site arrival point. So if you're designing or constructing a parking lot, even though it's going to be primitive, okay, the requirement stands that you have to make accessible parking. Now, if it's just where people are pulling off the side of the road and goat pathing it to whatever they're doing, there's no requirement for that. You've not designed or constructed anything. But if you design and construct something, I would say you need an accessible parking space. If it's an existing facility and it's currently not identified, I would look at it as a barrier, as part of a transition plan for that site that over time needs to be done. Okay? Any other questions we want to address now? No? So the next webinar that we did, or forum that we did, was just in September, and we talked about accessible picnic and camping facilities, and the amenities that go with those. Such an important opportunity. And here again, remember, these are requirements under the Architectural Barriers Act for federal sites, but a best practice, a minimum. So when I talk about a minimum, and I'm talking about picnic facilities, that standard says that at least 20% of your picnic units in that picnic facility, okay, where two or more are provided, must be accessible. We're going to talk a little bit about what accessible means, but it would be a path like I'm showing you here, an accessible table. The only thing I don't like about this picture here is that the pedestal grill is off the hard surface and the accessible clear floor space would not be covered here. That grill should be closer, or a pad provided around it based on, what the clear floor space requirements are in the standard for pedestal grills. If there's only two or fewer, each one of your picnic units should be accessible. Now that's a scoping requirement, right? And that's a minimum. And you could show that at least by following that, you have the intent to make sure that that program and your facilities are accessible. I would say you adopt that as a scoping provision in the requirements and use these as a best practice or a directive, understanding that it's not every single one. I don't have to make every one of them. It would be better if you made more of them. I think anytime you're buying an accessible picnic table, it should be an accessible one, even though it may not be on a paved or hard surface like this. It might be under a tree, might be in the grass, but at least if someone makes it there on a piece of adaptive equipment, or however they pull you backwards through the trees or sand or whatever it's in, that you still have an opportunity to have that accessible dining surface is huge. And if you're replacing the tops, putting on new 2x8s on the top of your picnic tables, make them 2 foot longer, hang out one end, make an accessible space on that dining surface. I think, I think you should follow what the Department of Agriculture is doing. And that means they say if they're going to buy a feature like that, an element, what we call an outdoor constructed feature, that they're going to make sure it's accessible, even if it's not in an accessible location. That the elements they're going to buy are accessible. That's just an inclusive way to think about it. If we're talking about camping, it's a table. So for each type of camping provided, and the standard really addresses RV trailer spaces, tent pads that are raised or lowered, and camp shelters like the one I'm showing you here. That it applies to each type of camping unit provided. So if you had tent spaces, you'd go to this chart and say, I have, 25 tent spaces. I need 2 of those to be accessible. And then I have RV spaces at the other end, and the RV spaces, I have 6. I got to say that I need, again, 2 of those to be accessible. So I would use this table as a best practice for how many units need to be accessible in the whole facility. The requirements for picnic camping address a lot of different things, 14 different elements. They provide clear floor space requirements and operable part or reach range requirements for tables, fire rings, grills, fireplaces, stoves, trash and recycling, water hydrants, sewer and utility hookups, outdoor rinsing showers, benches, and viewing scopes if you're in a viewing area. I'm showing you a campsite here that's got a concrete wall fire pit. I really think these are important to either do a double wall fire ring or a concrete one in your accessible units. I really think everywhere. I'm a person that uses a manual wheelchair. I don't feel my lower extremities. You can get too close to a heated surface. A kid reaching in there, touching their leg or the knee against something. It's so much better to have a double insulated type of opportunity for somebody to lean up against. I wanted to highlight a couple of things because we got a lot of questions about fishing piers, and so they were pre-submitted. First, let me just tell you that the screen is showing you some more resources for you with websites. I did a webinar on fishing and boating facilities for the U.S. Access Board, and I've given you the link that goes straight to it. It's free. You can get the whole PowerPoint. They let you download them all. If you can sell it, you can get whatever you get for it. It's in the public domain. And then there's the technical assistance guides that I've showed you here for both fishing and boating and how you get to those. Once you get to that website, you go to the specific facility type of guide you want. I think one of the important features of the guides is at the very last page is a provisional index. It gives you all the provisions, okay, all the provisions that you find for both of those facility types in that guide provisional index. So important to understand. And so I thought I'd go through some of the questions we had about fishing. It says, is every dock available for public to fish from fall under the 2010 regulations for fishing piers? They do. Remember, anything newly designed or constructed after March 15th of 2012 would be required to comply with this requirement. And so built prior to that, you'd want to evaluate it based on the standard, the requirements for that type of facility, and see where the barriers are. Identify that, create a transition plan for that facility, and over time, eliminate those barriers. But make sure that on that body of water, you have at least one fishing pier that meets it straight away. And that might be the one that you find that has the best side arrival, the flattest contour that's, easiest to get to, that you can make sure is right from the beginning. And so if it's not right now, you should prioritize the easiest one to make that still provides that great opportunity for fishing. Don't just pick one where, it's a very limited location. Nobody wants to fish there anyway. But make it one that's easy to make it first thing. Make it so that there's this opportunity almost immediately because there's only a few things we need to do. Improve the parking space, maybe improve the route to it, maybe lower a fishing rail, but maybe you already have it. You're real close. So identify the easiest one to make, the fastest one to make if you have none now. But the idea would be is that all over time, hopefully, whenever altered, become accessible, right? That's the whole idea. So it says, when evaluating access to fishing piers, do you have a greater level of access related to accessible route versus being on a trail? That doesn't affect the facility itself. Okay, so the route to it doesn't affect the requirements for that facility. So the standard would be the same. You design and construct a fishing pier, whether it's way out in the middle of the woods or it's in an urban area right off of a parking lot or transportation stop, the requirements would still be the same. So location doesn't change the minimum requirements for that type of facility. The next one, I guess we had some on boating. It's very similar to fishing. It could actually be quite a bit similar. It could be the same opportunity. It says, should a boating dock area with parking have accessible parking designated that offers parking or has a standalone parking lot? Remember, you design or construct a parking lot, it has to have accessible parking. And that accessible parking, if there's only one space, is a van space and it's 16 feet wide. 8-foot space, 8-foot access out, or an 11-foot space and a 5-foot access, but it's still 16. So the requirement there is if you decide to do it, create a parking facility, you need to understand how many cars are there. The accessible parking needs to meet it. And it could be just using a combination of crushed stone that you can get quarried near you and compacting that and maintaining that surface. I see a lot of times where they're asphalted, the accessible space is asphalted and striped and a whole bit and signs up, and then the whole rest of the parking lot's gravel. The challenge that I see with that most often is that change in level between the asphalt and the rest of that parking lot at stone can be a couple of inches and really challenging to get on and off of. So if you're going to pave or concrete the space, make sure that change in level off of it is compliant of no greater than a half inch. And that's going to take some work, maybe backfilling and understanding that change in level has to be minimized. We had a question too that came in about portable toilets, and the portable toilets was an enclosure had been made, and when they made the enclosure for this portable toilet, this wooden enclosure, I guess, three-walled, that it wouldn't incorporate the size of the accessible portable toilet. Remember, the standard says when you're doing portables, it's 5%, but no less than one. So it would require, if this is the only portable restroom there, that enclosure be increased to include the size of an accessible one if you wanted an enclosure. I would probably, if the facility is open year round, you're, I don't know, ice fishing or whatever's going to go on here, I would say that you would want to bring out an accessible portable one and at least set it next to the enclosure at this time. I would say that I would want to make sure that I had the accessible one over a non-accessible one just because I only have the one enclosure. So my vote would be is that you put the accessible one out, become compliant, and show the sensitivity, and then maybe in the spring or when you have an opportunity again, you need to extend the back and one side to incorporate the larger accessible unit. But I would think it's a real learning experience to understand that from here forward, you need to understand the minimum clear floor space and pad that you're creating and enclosure that you're creating for the accessible one and always use that one first or always just use that one. So great learning experience. Sorry it had to happen. And I think one of the things that I say a lot in my trainings is who's being excluded, right? Look at your designs, look at your things that you're trying to create and say, who would be excluded by this? Well, if you only had that toilet room there, that portable toilet that isn't accessible, you could see right away who's not being included, right? Who's being excluded. So I would think that looking at it from that perspective as well, of who's being excluded may help in the long run to facilitate greater access. But I'm hoping it's a learning experience and shared with others so that from here forward, the enclosure size is only for the larger unit, the accessible one. And really, I mean, I've not I've not seen where the accessible one to rent it is more than the non-accessible one. At least where I live, it's not. And so I would really argue with who's ever supplying those that why do we even want the smaller one, right? I mean, why do we really want it? I mean, if you're a parent with a child or you're helping your spouse or whatever you're trying to do there, that extra space is always appreciated. I know that when I go to a festival or something like that, and there's an accessible one on the end, and then there's a whole row of non-accessible, I have to fight in my wheelchair just to get the accessible one because so many people want that one. So I would think from here forward, you would just say, we're only doing accessible ones everywhere we go, if that's possible. I've highlighted on the screen here, when we were talking about trails and surfacing, when I was at the Access Board, we did a trail surface study. There's two parts of this. The first one was, and we're showing you a group of people out here evaluating it right now. And we tried to understand how many people were going across it and the freeze and thaw cycles that we had. This was put out at Bradford Woods in Indiana, part of the Indiana University. And we had 9 different surface material types. And we looked at whether it was a spray-on topical on dirt or it was stone or it was some kind of an epoxy. We looked at what we could do with natural surfaces to try make them firm and stable. And then the second half of this is a survey monkey where we asked people from around the country to talk to us about what additives or what were they doing to natural surface trails to make them more accessible, and could they share that with our audience? And so the whole end of that report, that study, is on people that wrote in from all across the country on what they were doing to make things more accessible. And then we also studied engineered wood fiber, that play area surfacing, and bound it. Now, we did it at Governor Dodge State Park in Wisconsin, and the thing we had here was that lake overflowed and water undermined it, and it really took it away from the beach. But I've seen this being used in other locations where they didn't have that flood issue. And it really made a hard, natural looking surface that could be used site arrival points, things like that. I've worked with the Boy Scouts at national jamborees, and we've provided accessible parking and site arrival points using large brick, like geoforms filled with gravel. There may be a way to increase the level of accessibility, but still keep it permeable so that you can meet the requirements of being close to water. For trail, I strongly urge that if you're doing a natural surface trail, whether it's dirt or stone, to think about looking at this study and trying to see if any of the products or methods of compaction work for you. I ran through almost all my slides. I'm hoping we've got some talkative people. If not, I'll make up a question. You got one for me, Joe? No?
We don't have any questions. This is a great time. If you do have any questions, please submit them into the chat box. We'd love to get them before Bill. Yeah, Bill, if you've got a couple questions in
I
mind,
do.
or if
I've got some more pre-submitted ones. And one was they asked if I've ever seen a way to really get on boats that's accessible. And there is. Now, a lot of times when you're talking speedboats, fishing boats, there's even an opportunity to get on if you're not by yourself and you don't have to do it independently, is to preload, create a ramp system with a platform adjacent to your boat launch ramp that somebody then would be at almost the same height with a mobility device as getting over that gunnel or onto that boat. And I've seen several of those that are very nice to where you have the opportunity to preload before the boat's put into the water. So you might look for some of those opportunities. When we're talking power of sailboats, they use a boom hoist where you use the actual, boom on the sailboat with a sling. I sail at an organization called CRAB. It's Chesapeake Recreational Adaptive Boating here on the Chesapeake Bay. And they use a solar powered lift that they have these tubes put on the deck at certain locations at boat slips to where they walk out with the solar powered lift. In my manual chair, I put a sling underneath me, so lift up. A volunteer helps pull it all the way underneath me, and then we hook that sling up to this overhead hoist that's again solar powered with a little joystick at the end of a little remote at the end of a phone cord, and it lifts me out of my chair, and they can swing me manually over the boat and lower me down into the cockpit or into the vessel itself. And there's also transfer systems where it's basically a transfer platform at the height of a wheelchair seat. So you'd slide over onto that and then bump down in towards a vessel. A lot of party barges or things like that have a 32-inch opening door. So if you can get at the main level or a small ramp, programmatically, if you're doing some type of boating class or sessions or clinics, you really need to work with the supportive group. Paddling, there's all kinds of easy dock systems where it's easier to transfer on. The boat can come up, the kayak or canoe can come up on rollers and be stable while you're getting on and off it. And then you roll right off that ramp roller to get right into the water. It's a lot of fun to do, but it makes access in and out of the vessels a lot easier. So whether you're power boating, you're sailboating, you're paddling, there are improved ways of getting on or supporting the opportunity for people with disabilities that may not be able to use their legs getting on and off. There's a question here. It says, does someone need to have certain certifications or credentials to do evaluations of existing conditions for a transition plan? Well, hopefully somebody's got a great understanding of the minimum requirements, but a certification, no. I've seen where, well, let me just back up. If you go to adachecklist.org, it's run by the ADA, Northeast ADA National Network, and I'm going to give you a slide coming up on that. But adachecklist.org, you can get checklists that I've seen people use, Boy Scout groups or civic groups, to go out and use those checklists to bring back initial information. And then maybe after that, somebody that's a little more versed in the requirements goes out and verifies and checks to see what they found. But I think it could be great Boy Scout projects, could be great civic group projects to help you identify where there are barriers. And there may be centers for independent living and organizations that support recreation for adaptive sports or recreation that would be willing. Maybe therapeutic recreation groups. Like I said, centers for independent living. may be willing to help with some of that evaluation. But I would think the final report and the final evaluation, you'd want somebody that's very well versed in the requirements to understand a number of different issues. But do you require a certification to do those? No. I would say the better the more you do, the better you get at them, and understanding that over time will aid you. Well, I'm a person that uses a wheelchair, but I wheel into a space and immediately understand that what I can do and what I can't do, right? So enlisting people um, that have a disability into that evaluation process can can be very quick. So I would say the final report, you'd want somebody to really look at it that has a great understanding, but to do the initial evaluations, no, I think you can do it. There was a question about boat launch ramps and about is it okay to have a primitive one and then maybe an accessible one? And I do think they could provide different opportunities. I would still challenge you to incorporate the greatest level of access and inclusion, even in the one that's primitive. Remember, if you create an accessible parking lot or create a parking lot, regardless if it's at a primitive site or non, you've created a parking lot, and the standard doesn't say, "Hey, if you're 5 miles out of town, you don't have to do it," or if you're near a river that's got to have, a permeable surface, you don't have to do this. There's none of that. And it just says if you design and construct a parking facility, then you have to have accessible. So there would be certain features, even at a rustic or very primitive location, that if you designed or constructed it now, there wouldn't be an exception to get away from being accessible. Um, Now, there is technical infeasibility. And in the standard, it says that, and site topography is one of the issues that they talk about. If there's no way to create it, you do the best you can, right? If it's what we call technical and feasible, that you still do the best you can, whether that's the running slope or the surface material or whatever it is. So yes, it's okay to have rustic ones and more urban ones, but I would challenge you that all of them, if they're newly designed and constructed, would need to comply. If they're existing, I would still identify where there's barriers. I would still have an accessible site arrival point, regardless if I did the parking lot. I created that. I'd still have to do accessible parking, even if it's very rustic. And if you only provided one portable toilet there, it would need to be an accessible one. So I'll back up. People that recreate with disabilities are stretching the boundaries more and more. And whether that's with adaptive equipment, with help, with the desire to do it, with the type of equipment that's available, you're going to find that even the rustic sites, you're going to find somebody that's still going to try paddle out of there, still try hit that, still try do the trail. And you would want to make sure that the supportive services that you've implemented or supplied or constructed in that location meet those minimum requirements. Anything from you guys yet?
Yes, Bill. And before I ask this question, I just want to note for everybody, I'm going to throw a link for an evaluation into the chat box. Doesn't mean we're done. I just want to make sure everyone can grab it before they have to go. But we do have another question from Jennifer to keep this rolling. What are your favorite accessible and inclusive playground features you have seen or experienced?
Well, there's been a lot of push for the wheelchair swing. I don't think the wheelchair swing's the way to go unless you have a supervised play environment. So I wouldn't advocate for the swing, but there's a lot. There's the movement from away from a transfer system to a like conveyor belt material is really making it a lot easier to crawl or get up to an elevated level. I think at the bottom of a slide, if there's the ability to get out of the way for persons with disabilities to wait for their mobility device to get back is huge. So like a slide aside, they call it a little platform to make it easier to transfer. I think that's huge. They make a carousel or a turnstile that where it's at grade, they sink it into the ground where you get that spinning motion to be a part of it. More and more surface characteristics that can challenge a person with a mobility device or that may have difficult walking. Maybe an undulating surface that kids use to ride their bikes on or skateboard around the perimeter of the play area, but also persons with mobility devices can challenge themselves and learn how to use their device better. I think that there's a lot of swings that are made now that if you don't have trunk or neck support, regardless of your age, that there's an opportunity to enjoy swinging. Um, I think the more we can provide ramp access and play value for individuals once they get there is an important feature. Um, it, Most kids don't come to a park to do tic-tac-toe on a play panel. Um, they're not coming to learn sign language on a communication board. They want to interact. They want to challenge themselves physically and socially and interact. And so, providing the greatest inclusion, looking for products that really support play at a ground level, can really be huge to be interactive. But also think about that group of people. I did a webinar on play areas and young people that are neurodivergent, and you guys have a lot of lakes. I mean, more than 10,000, they say. So I mean, that can be a very dangerous situation in a play area if you had somebody that had autism and they had that elopement idea where they had to run or flee or get away. And so I think landscaping or protecting the play environment from hazardous areas, whether it's a busy street, it's a running pond, a river or a pond, whatever that danger issue is close by. I think that landscaping or sometimes even fencing can support greater inclusion by a group and having a quiet area. Maybe there's some tunnels where they can sit and be alone or things like that. So really thinking about the diverse population of people and players. I honestly think we need more adult stuff. I think older people should be playing on these things. I think it should be an opportunity not just for children to 12 years old. I mean, well, I always use the joke, well, I'm a swinger, so I like to swing, but I would say that you need to play every day, right? Somehow you need to get an experience of challenging yourself or enjoying. And I'm a believer of what we call incidental fitness too. And that is put outdoor fitness equipment to where people would really be, sitting at a bus stop. How about that? On college campuses all over. Don't make people go into a gym. Have the opportunity to do it on your own wherever you can. So that kind of goes a little bit beyond, but I would think that you want to really look at how we can include the widest population of ages, abilities in our play areas and not just segregate them to 5 to 12-year-olds and 3 to 5-year-olds. We hope that you make it an opportunity for parents to want to come and be a part of that same facility. Maybe they're working out on a step climber that's an outdoor fitness equipment while their kids are running around. But make the opportunity for everybody to participate, the widest age group, the widest ability population in these play areas as you can. It's really challenging anymore because the surfacing can be such a huge part of the budget, right? And so it's so important to think about what play value and what play types or characteristics do we want to be helping young people learn here or socialize with. So it's a very important thing because it really, they last for decades, right? And you want to make sure that you provided something that's going to last, be safe, be as independent as possible, and the widest user group.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. We do have a couple more questions that have come in. Todd asks, are there standard template accessible RV campsite designs and accessories that we can use off the shelf rather than trying to design ones that may or may not meet the best practices for accessibility?
That's an interesting one. I know that the Park Service, and if you reached out to somebody at the Denver Service Center for the National Park Service, they have, their service has developed RV and trailer sites and tent sites that they dictate on federal land. And I'm hoping that they would share where they're placing the utilities and the hookups and the width of their spaces, their drive-in spaces, how they're doing it with you. But that would be my recommendation is probably, I don't know of a template straight off, but I know that they developed one because I looked at it many, many years ago and that they use it when they send it out. So I'm hoping that the Denver Service Center, folks at the National Park Service will help you identify that and provide something that meets, because they are being required to comply with those minimum requirements in the standard that I shared with you.
Thank you. Drew has a good one, a little something different.
Okay.
Does being able to drive to a location count as an accessible connection pathway? And is it considered accessible if slope would be too steep for ADA accessibility standards, but you could drive to the park feature and access it from there?
That's always an opportunity, right? I mean, I go to one at a place called Black Hills Regional Park right outside where I live here. And to get down to the lake, it's huge drop. And that's what they've done. Right down by the marina, they've provided accessible parking. Now, here's the challenges. If you have a large lot up above, okay, that does require accessible parking, you can move those spaces down below, but now you have two parking facilities. You have to count all the spaces in both, okay, even if they're employee spaces, and you have to determine how many accessible ones, but they could be moved to that lower level. I encourage you to still have a couple up above. Okay. I always say that the van space should be the farthest one away in the cluster so that it's not the first one taken by somebody in a Mini Cooper. Or whatever other car they were driving. Because I'll tell you that need for that van space and that wide access aisle is so important to make sure that persons that use a van with a ramp or a lift have that opportunity. But that's a great opportunity. I see it done with sports fields. I see it done with fishing and boating facilities is move that site arrival point for the person with a disability as close as possible. You know everybody's going to want it, right? So it's going to be under high pressure to get used. So that's an encouragement to try to make sure you got more. If you're only putting one down there, it's a 16-foot space, so you got to have at least that. But understand that the route to get down to it sometimes is even the route a lot of people walk. So making sure that you have safe pedestrian access on that road that you're providing now down to that lower level. But yes, remember that if you have elements that are at the top, like a toilet and bathing facility, yes, on existing sites, I would say go for it. If the site characteristics don't permit it in new construction, I would document that in the file why. I would always put whatever feature is up above down below so that you have an accessible route connecting to one of each of those as well. But yes, that is a really important feature is that if you can move that site arrival point closer to the feature you're providing, the facility, that site arrival route now is hopefully manageable. So great question.
Great. You've talked about this one a little bit previously to today, but not today. Can you talk a little bit about if you've built accessible facilities, how do you share that information with people so they know what to expect, or they can make a judgment call if it's accessible for them, whatever their situation may be, signage or postings or whatever that might look like?
And that's such an important feature. Like we all want to plan, right? We all want to know where we're going and what we're going to do. And when you're going to a recreation facility as a person with a disability, you're trying to overplan. And let's say that we've got the great opportunity now to have internet. We've got a great understanding to have a phone and GPS and everything that can get us to and from. But it is such an important feature. Let's start with how you advertise on your websites and printed material, or maybe at a large, I don't know, a session board or some kind of a trail description at the trailhead or some type of poster board that you're hanging up. It's so important to make sure that people understand what they can do, when they can use it, how to get the information, who to contact if they have questions, right? That's always important. But then understanding where the accessible features are on your site map. If there's lots of routes to one location, we need to identify which one's the accessible route. Maybe that's a different colored line on your map or a dotted line, or who knows how you're going to identify it. But that you identify where that accessible route is on large sites and how to get in certain facilities. If there's only one way in the visitor center and it's on the side. Understanding which units are accessible and how does the reservation system discourage people that don't need accessibility, and how do we make sure that those that really got it understand what's there so that they know they can use it. Describe what you have. Is it a pedestal grill? Is there a hard surface? Is it dirt? What do we have here? Is it a tent pad? How big is the tent pad? If it's an RV space, where are the utilities located? Off what side? What's the width? So describing as much as you can, and especially about your bathhouse, your toilet room. Do we have an accessible parking space at the bathhouse? Does the bathhouse have a transfer shower? Is it off to one side? What are you providing? Is so important. Is the concession area, is that accessible? Is the counter accessible? Understanding what you can do, and what is accessible at the facility should be something you're proud of. And it should be something that you tell the community that you want to understand that if it didn't meet their needs, how can we? Okay, that we're interested in this ongoing commitment to eliminate barriers whenever we possibly can. And that your input is huge to us. Um, Making sure your frontline staff knows what you have. Um, if it's a small amphitheater, you're doing a ranger educational thing. Do you have an assistive listening system if he's speaking on a microphone or she's speaking on a microphone? Um, does your staff know where things are? What could be used? If somebody's requesting large print or braille or things like that, what's the policy? Where do we go get that? Can we, if somebody's in a different language, can we use an interpreter service online? Or what can we do if we trying to facilitate this access? Do we have a manual wheelchair to help somebody get into the visitor center or over to the amphitheater? Are we providing some type of an adaptive piece of equipment that somebody really has to know how to use before they just take off into the woods on? Who's trained and when is it available? And how many hours of the day can you have it? Or where is it at? Can I transport it? Can I bring it to my campsite and leave it overnight? Um, just all the unique features that you're providing, staff needs to be trained on. They need to understand how to communicate. They need to understand what's a service animal and when they can ask a question and what, right? So making sure that your staff's aware, making sure that the information's available, and making sure that on the site things are well signed and people are told where they can go and where they can't, is such an important feature about making accessibility and recreation a possibility. I'll just say one last thing. 3D printing's gotten really cheap anymore. And if you have a large site and even some historic buildings or things you want to show, having a 3D little topographical map anymore is something that's really easy to do. Especially the younger you are, it seems. The But those 3D opportunities to understand how things are located, where, to get the lay of the land for somebody that has low vision or blind could be huge. Um, Understanding the assistive listening systems when they're required, even if you're indoors or outdoors. If you're speaking in a microphone, the requirement is for an assistive listening system. Okay, indoors or out, you're on a microphone, what we call audio amplification. There is the requirement for an assistive listening device. So if you're running a program where somebody's got an external little microphone they're hollering over, you need to make sure that that assistive listening is there and available and people understand where and how to get it. Don't ever put up videos that aren't captioned. Okay. That should just be one thing right here. If you're putting a video up, okay, it needs to be captioned. If you're putting pictures up on your website, you need to have an alt text describing what that picture is of so that if somebody scrolls a screen reader across it, it says image of and describes it so they understand what they're looking at. Okay. So making sure your websites are compliant with screen readers, Section 508 compliance, is huge. There's lots of ways to learn how to do that and lots of companies that can help. But making sure that the information is available to everybody is going to increase your participation, is going to show that you have this welcoming and embracing people's different abilities and being inclusive beyond just accessible.
Awesome.
That's the gospel to Bill.
Fantastic. I don't have any additional questions. Renee, do you have anything that's been on top of your mind?
I just made a note to myself that we need to work on our website. So that's now top of mind for us. Thank you, Bill. Every time you have the opportunity to provide information at a forum, it is just phenomenal. Your wealth of knowledge is so appreciated, and we're really grateful that you have taken time out of your retirement to present forums for us and respond to questions as they've come in from our facilities and review plans and playground drawings to make sure that we're providing the best possible experience for everybody in our system that's visiting our system, and everyone understands that. So thanks a lot.
let's just end then with the last couple slides I have for resources, because we want people to understand that there is help, right? There is help in getting and understanding what you need to know. And the National ADA Network has a national conference every year that's really important to go. Minneapolis hosted it 2 years ago. What a great treat it was to be up there doing that. This coming year, it's going to be in Phoenix, Arizona in July. You can learn so much in 3 days there that your head will pop. It's such a great experience to get such a diversity of inclusion throughout a wide spectrum of facilities, program access. There's tons of sessions on transition plans, understanding how to do those. So I gave you the list there where you find the recreation facility checklist that I talked to you about earlier. I've given you their 800 number. You've got a great one that your regional center's out of Chicago, Illinois, and it's the Great Lakes ADA Center run by Robin Jones. What a great group of people. They run a monthly webinar series with the U.S. Access Board that's all free, CEUs, everything. But that 800 number will get you to their staff and they can really help you. If you're looking to make your website better, they can get you the information you need. Whatever you're looking for, great guidance, great training. And finally, we talked about the two enforcing agencies and how to reach out to them. And understanding is they might go back to work this week or next. It's getting close, they act like. So the Department of Justice, the one on the left, is the enforcing agency for the Americans with Disabilities Act. Look at their website. Understand some of the issues before you go call them. The 800 number, voice number, on their website, it tells you when they're available. They're not now. When they come back, you can get a live person. Understand when you call a federal agency, you have to understand who you're talking to and time and date it and write down the notes about what they said. Okay. You always want to be able to go back to that same person and understand who said what when. So always make sure you ask their name straight up. They may not want to give it to you, but make sure that you get it and you get their contact information if they'll give it to you. The U.S. Access Board's a little more open with information. You can even send them an email and they'll give you a written response. So that's always cool, is to get a written response from a federal agency. It's usually only when you owe money. But the Access Board will do it at ta@access-board.gov. And they have a voice number too. And I strongly urge you to call them both. Get an answer from both of them if you got the time and see if there's any differences. Understand what's one's telling you and the other one's saying. One may be a lot better than the other. I've got my bias. The access-board.gov website is where you find the technical assistance guides. It's where you should be using. Across the top, there's a toolbar and it says the Americans with Disabilities Act. When you drop it down, that's the standard that you should be using, the virtual standard. It's all hyperlinked from one to the other, so it's way easier to use. I guess I'll just end. I know we're a few minutes early if there's no more questions, by saying that it's been a great opportunity. I was born in Minnesota in Fridley, long time ago, 1958. But I love the state of Minnesota and get back regularly. And I cannot imagine a more worthwhile opportunity as making Minnesota more inclusive. And once it is, and as is, it is now, to highlight those accessible features, that the populations of people that love to come to Minnesota are aging just like everybody else, and that providing those 10,000 lakes with great opportunity to fish and boat and camp and picnic and enjoy life with your family and friends is what it's all about. And so your actions and the facilities that you construct are very meaningful. They're going to last for decades. We need to make sure they're not only accessible, but they're inclusive, and that the thought process includes as many people from the widest diverse population as you can get to make sure we're supporting everyone's needs. So I thank you for taking the time out of your day, giving me this opportunity to preach a little bit about how important accessibility is to those with disabilities, and hope that when you're constructing or designing something in the future, you think about who's being excluded first.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. We appreciate it. For all those attending, the video will be up on our website along with the presentation slides as soon as we can make it available, as soon as we get done editing and hopefully adding some captions. Renee, do you have anything else to close out with?
I don't. Thanks everyone for being here, and look forward to having more forums. We'll know about that soon for the future. But your time and attention to this is really appreciated. So thanks for participating.